My mom's in a meeting. She's gonna watch the recording, and I'm assuming my dad's getting on, so, or is on, one of the two. I'm not sure. Oh, slide to the left or right. Sorry.
All right, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming today. We are here for Robby May's dissertation defense of his dissertation, Science Leadership Academy, a learning community for creating freedom-fighting warrior scholar change agents. I am his dissertation chair, Dr. Heather Hurst, and also the program director of the EDD program in educational leadership. And I'd like to introduce his committee members and thank them for serving. We have with us, that you can see online, Dr. Jodi Eirich, who is an associate professor of education here at Frostburg State University, and Dr. Lili Leonard, who is the senior director of development at the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. And so let me talk briefly about how the defense will go. We've asked Robby to prepare a 30-minute presentation about his dissertation. If you are interested in reading his dissertation, we can share that with you after the defense. Please feel free to contact me or Robby directly for it. Obviously, he cannot include everything that is in the dissertation in today's presentation. So it really is just an overview. After he is finished, we'll open up to questions first from the committee. And after the committee's questions have been exhausted, we'll open up to questions from the audience, including those of you who are online as time permits. At that point in time, when we've finished questions, we'll ask everyone except for the committee to leave the room, including Robby. We'll pause the live feed for those of you who have been watching from home so the committee can deliberate, and then we'll invite everyone back in for the results and next steps. All right, Robby, floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. So I'll just briefly introduce myself for those of you that are not familiar with me, and I think it's important to have some background of who I am before I begin my dissertation defense. So as Dr. Hurst said, my name's Robby May. Up until last year, I worked in K-12 education as a secondary National Board Certified Social Studies teacher. During the last 13 years, I've had the opportunity to work in public charter schools, in private schools, and in public schools as well too. And then about a year ago, I made the decision, a very hard decision, to kind of do a little bit of a slide, not a complete jump out of the world of education, and go to one of my other passions, which is paramedicine. I've been serving in EMS since I was 16 years old. And so today I now work for the Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue Services. I oversee all of their advanced life support or paramedic education. So let's actually dive in. I'm excited to share about my dissertation in rapid fire speed over the next 30 minutes with you. So I think before I begin, it's really important for me to acknowledge my own biases as we go into the study. So at the heart of the United States, and specifically education in the United States, I feel that there are laws that are woven in the fabric of who actually gets to learn in the United States, with whom one can learn, and where one can learn. Additionally, I have an inherent belief that social justice education and teaching for social justice is good teaching, and it should be occurring in every classroom. I think it's necessary now more than ever in our world, but especially in the country, and it shouldn't be reserved for any specific demographic group, any specific type of school, specific area, etc. All students should have the opportunity to have a social justice education. So I also want to make some definitions clear here, because there's a lot of ideas around just exactly what social justice education actually is. So I ended up using for the study Bell's definition of social justice. And I'm going to go ahead and read this because it's really fundamental to what we're talking about. So Bell says, social justice is the full and equal participation of all groups in society that's mutually shaped to meet their needs and includes a vision of society in which distribution of resources is equitable and all members are psychologically and physically safe and secure. So when I refer to social justice, when I referred to social justice in the interviews, this is the definition that I used, and actually students and participants in the interview had this definition up while they were doing the interview with me. And then the second term that I use, including in the title, is change agents. And so the definition that I developed for what a change agent is someone who's committed to advancing social justice in their communities by creating positive social change. So one of the things I want to clarify right away is why change agent? Why not another synonym of change agent, activist, community organizer, etc.? And I'll be very honest with you. At the start of this process, I really didn't think one way or another about why I specifically chose change agent. It's not until more recently when I read Walren's book, The Lightmaker's Manifesto, that I started to think about this more deeply, because she dives into this in her own writing when she talks about the word activism. So I actually see the word activism, change agent, community organizer, really all the same thing in my head. And I think that one of the mistakes that we so often make is that when we think of an activist, we think of someone on the front lines with a police barricade, with signs up, or someone that's standing outside the front of the Supreme Court, or someone that's working actively with a legislator to change. We think of basically, at the end of the day, big changes. And this is one of the things that I ran into with my participants in the study too, because when they thought about themselves as change agents, many of them at first didn't see themselves as change agents, because they thought that a change agent had to be someone that was doing huge, fantastical things. And really, that's not what a change agent, well, it certainly is a change agent, but that's not the only thing. And I think we know the vast majority of change happens through small actions right within our communities. So let's dive into why social justice education. So in the last 10 years, we have seen an attack on social justice specifically, social justice topics, minority communities, especially in the United States, but across the world. And this includes in the world of education, especially in the last 2 years. I really attribute that to the catalyst of Donald Trump's failed bid for a second term in office. So, of course, when that occurred, probably the tipping point or the most concerning thing for people was the historic insurrection that we saw occur at the United States Capitol in January of 2021, when you had far-right domestic terrorists surge the Capitol to try to prevent the election results from occurring. Since that time, since that catalyst, we have seen a wave of state legislators across the country pass all sorts of different laws attacking social justice topics, attacking education, attacking what students and teachers have the ability to do within the classroom. So let's look at a couple of examples. So last year in the Arizona legislature, they actually passed a law that prohibited schools from requiring teachers to engage students in controversial issues. And they actually put a $5,000 fine on that for teachers. The interesting piece about this is they don't define what the controversial issues are or what a controversial issue is in the law itself. Over the last 2 years, we've seen an attack on critical race theory, a collegiate academic theory that I think if you talk to the vast majority of educators in the K-12 setting, myself included, is not something that is taught in a K-12 setting. But there's this far-flung idea that has been taken on and purported by extremists. And so you've seen legislator after legislator after legislature over the last year ban critical race theory. This is from the end of the 2021 state legislative season, because the 2022 season is still occurring. And then finally, in Florida, in 2021, Governor DeSantis signed a law, that actually required university students and faculty to declare their political beliefs to the state. And then just most recently, within the last month, Florida passed what's been now known to be called the Don't Say Gay bill, which basically prohibits free speech around teachers talking about LGBT issues and allowing students to talk about LGBT issues in the classroom itself. As a result of Florida's example, although I hate to use that word example, 12 other states now have also tried or are currently working to pass similar bills in the United States. So now more than ever, there is a need for social justice education, but it's not new. It's not new. It's not from the last 2 years. It's not from the last 10 years. Really, we've been having a discussion about social justice and specifically social justice in education for the last 50 years. And really, I would say that that began with Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed in 1970. So it's a fantastic book. You can read more about it, but I want to give you a real brief overview of what's talked about in this book. So Paulo Freire talks about the idea of traditional education. And unfortunately, traditional education still occurs, even though we know as teachers it's not great education. And he uses what's called this banking concept, where the idea is that the teacher is this know-all person in the room, it's the job of the teacher as the expert to deliver fact or deposit fact into students. Students are docile, they're just receptacles. And so we see that with a lot of traditional teaching. And it's not that in of itself the idea is bad, but the problem is students don't get to do anything with their learning. Okay, so we talk about when we have courses that are just straight lecture based in a K-12 type of setting. And so Freire proposes this idea of what he calls problem posing education, which I would tie today to what we call inquiry based or project-based learning, which is at the heart of SLA, which I'll talk about here in just a minute with my study. And so in this idea, students are not docile listeners anymore. Instead, students and teachers are co-learners together. They are co-investigators together. The curriculum is more of, here, I'm the teacher, I'm giving you the curriculum, here, memorize this. Now let's actually dive into the curriculum. Let's talk about your questions. Let's explore those things. But at the big piece behind this is that students should be able to develop what Freire called a critical consciousness. And so when students develop a critical consciousness, according to Freire, basically they understand the oppressions that they face, the social injustices that they face, and they gain the tools to fight that oppression and to realize and take action against those systems that oppress them in society. So Freire talks about the idea of neutrality, and I think this is really important. And some of you, who are watching this, might think about this because of me having formerly been a social studies teacher. Freire talks about, and I 100% agree with him, that teaching in of itself is a political act. And I especially think that that is true considering the things that we've talked about. He says, I do not see why I should omit or hide my political stance by proclaiming a neutral position that does not exist. On the contrary, my role as a teacher is to assent the student's right to compare, to choose, to repute, to decide. And I think that one of the biggest things, and this again comes out in my research with SLA, is that we as teachers have to give students the understanding of looking at different types of media, understanding what's trustworthy, what's not trustworthy, understanding bias in media, and giving them the forum where they can learn from people who are diverse from themselves, where they can ask questions, where they can investigate, so that they can do this part, which I think is ultimately what we want to see with our students, so that they can compare, they can choose, they can repute, and they can decide. Because if our students can do that when they're in a K-12 setting, imagine what they can do when they're adults and they're working for change through their careers, etc. So I have two research questions that I explored. The first is to what degree and in what ways are alumni at Science Leadership Academy change agents in their communities? And the second is, in what ways, if any, does attending SLA create adults who are change agents in their communities? So my theoretical framework is really grounded in two different scholars. The first is Dover and her Teaching for Social Justice model. And so Dover talks about the idea that teaching for social justice is much more than just students understanding social justice issues. Of course, that's important, but it has to go beyond that. It has to be that students actually gain the skills so that they can take those issues that they're passionate about, so that they can research those things so that they can figure out how they can work to change those and then change those in their communities. And she calls them, or she gives the idea that we should be preparing freedom-fighting intellectuals who are warrior scholars, okay, who are going to use both their critical thinking and their creative abilities to combat the things that they are most passionate about in their communities. And then Dover has a model for teaching of social justice, which is really the framework of how I looked at, or part of the framework of how I looked at SLA. And she really includes three big aspects: curriculum, pedagogy, and social action. And so the idea here is that these things are all intertwined, and that when developing curriculum, we are considering the communities of our students and our individual students' backgrounds. And we have explicit instruction about oppression, about prejudice, and equity. When we consider our pedagogy, and this again is going to connect to what we see at SLA, that you have this relational and supportive classroom environment where students feel safe and protected. And then the last piece on social action, where students are actually able to take their knowledge and see themselves as social activists and to actually create change. And then the final piece of my theoretical framework is North's social justice literacies. I'll get more into these specific literacies here in just a few minutes. But I want you to understand that when I say the word literacy, I'm not referring strictly to reading and writing, but specifically ways that schools are doing things and different models and teaching methodologies, pedagogy, et cetera, that schools are using around social justice education. So when you look at the literature, it's kind of fascinating. So I actually thought that there would probably be other studies out there already done looking at schools that had a social justice focus, and specifically what the results were of those schools when students graduated and had passed. Because there are a lot of schools, especially when we look at the charter school movement across the United States, that purport to have a social justice focus. But honestly, there really is not that research that's out there. When you look at the literature, really I grouped it into 5 different areas of things that I was seeing, I saw a lot of research around critical pedagogy, which is not exactly the same thing, but has connections to social justice education. I saw research on Brazil's citizen schools, which is probably the closest related to what I got into with my study. And that is a model that's based on Paulo Freire, because Brazil is Paulo Freire's home country, where they have turned education and communities completely on their head. And the way that education is done has moved away from this banking model to this idea of critical consciousness. And so they've done studies on those schools. They've done studies on pre-service teachers who are taking some type of social justice class as a part of their education studies. But the interesting piece is they're studying them when they're undergrads or in master's programs, preparing them for teachers, but then they're not following up with them in the classroom. They've done specific studies on educators who are committed to social justice, and they've also done studies on how they are raising critical consciousness in students. So let's talk really briefly about Science Leadership Academy, which is the heart of my study. So SLA was established in 2006 between a partnership with the School District of Philadelphia and the Franklin Institute. It is a public school in Philadelphia. It's a magnet school within Philadelphia. And students from any zip code within the School District of Philadelphia can apply for entrance into SLA. The entire curriculum at SLA is inquiry-based. And so I think one of the important things to understand is it's not siloed. So we don't think of it as we're going to do a project in history class, or we're going to do a project in engineering class, or in film class, or in English, etc. But many of the projects are kind of interconnect and intertwine to the overall curriculum that students are learning. And then SLA has 5 core values. And I mention this here because these come up over and over again when I'm looking with my students, we'll talk about more. And they're inquiry, research, collaboration, presentation, and reflection. Learning at SLA is fundamentally different. And when I first had the opportunity to visit SLA a few years ago, I saw this, and it's part of the reason why I immediately fell in love with SLA the first time that I was there. So when you read Chris Lehman, who's the principal of SLA, is the founding principal, and continues to serve as principal at SLA, he talks about the view that staff takes of students. They see students as perennials and not annuals. So instead of the idea that we as a teacher have students for 180 days of a school year, they think of their students as who they are as not only individuals now, but who they are as individuals and learners the next year, the year after that, and into their adult lives. So there are a lot of things that make SLA different and great, and I could spend the next 3 hours talking about it, but they're not going to let me talk about that for that long. So I'd really encourage you, if you're interested, to look more into SLA. A couple highlights that I'll give. Every student at SLA has what's called an individualized learning plan. So a lot of times we think of a IEP that we use for special education students in the public school system. And this is not the same. Literally every student at SLA has an individualized learning plan that is individualized to them. And so that thought process is completely different than how we look at students often in traditional public schools. They also have the ability to participate in mini courses, which are courses that last 4 to 6 weeks in length. And they bring in individuals from the public. Teachers teach them as well too. They're on different topics, different interests. They could be hobbies. They could be about the actual business that the person's involved in. So it not only allows students to gain knowledge about a hobby or some area of interest that they have, but it also allows them to make connections for the internships that they'll participate in while they're students, and hopefully after graduation as well too. Of course, SLA is inquiry-based or project-based, which I've talked about a minute ago. And one of the other big things that came up frequently in my research was the senior capstone project. And I think that in many ways it's similar to what often bachelor degree students have to do as a part of their capstone course. So at SLA, during their senior year, students get to identify a problem or a specific research interest that they have. And they develop a framework for actually studying that and taking action around that. And it is a wide variety of things that you'll see, some of which I'll share from examples in the interviews that I had with students. So I think this quote from Chris Lehman really sums up SLA well. So when done well, schools help children to learn how to live lives of meaning. When done right, schools help children to become profoundly active citizens. And when done with care, schools help children to learn how to care for one another. I think that sentence alone really sums up what SLA is doing and ties in well with exactly what I'm looking at in this study. So quickly, the design and methodology for my study. So there are 3 elements to the study itself. The first was a quantitative survey. The second part was a lived experience journal, and the third part was the interview. So with the quantitative survey, there were no cap on the number of participants that I would take for it. And it had 2 main focuses. The first was to gain some demographic information. The second was to use Miller's social issues questionnaire, which allowed students to rate or rank themselves in 3 big categories: social justice self-efficacy, social justice interests, and then commitment to social justice. Altogether, I had 20 alumni who responded to the survey. Immediately when they were done the survey, they completed the lived experience journal. It took them directly to that. And so students had the opportunity to do this in one of 3 forms. They could do it via typing, they could record their voice, or they could video record themselves responding to the following prompt. The prompt was, do you believe that you've become a change agent since graduating from Science Leadership Academy? If so, how? So the nice thing about this is that it allowed me to not only get some data from those that I knew that I would not respond to an interview, but it also allowed me to craft interview questions that were specific to the individual alumni based on how they responded to this question. So once students completed the survey and lived experience journal, they were given an invite to participate in an interview, which would be done on Zoom for 30 minutes to an hour at a time of their preference. The goal was to have 15 participants in the interview. I ended up only getting 12. It was very difficult towards the end to get participants, and I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. But really what I discussed with my committee at that time was I felt that after the 12th interview, I really had started to reach some saturation in that I was hearing a lot of the same responses and a lot of the same information from my students. So I felt like that I'd really gotten a lot of the data that I was looking for in the actual interview. So the interview looked at 3 different areas of the participants' experience. Their social justice identity, which connected to their lived experience, the journal, their experience at SLA, and then the social justice work that they're doing in their present day lives. So when we actually look at participants, okay, they could be anyone that graduated from SLA since they first began graduating students. So the first class of students was in 2010. And then I had students that participated from graduating year 2010 through 2018. Recruitment was done for the study really primarily 2 ways. The first was through their private alumni Facebook group, which the faculty graciously allowed me to become a member of for the purpose of the study. And the second is through the school's alumni email that goes out where they put the information that I gave out in that. And then the final thing that I did, thanks to the recommendation of my committee, was the idea of a snowball effect. So asking people or alumni who had interviewed with me to ask some of the other people that they knew if they would be willing to interview. And that really did help in terms of gathering participants. So let's actually look at my summary of participant characteristics. So like I said, I had participants all the way from the first graduating year in 2010 up until 2018. The only graduating year that I did not have in that time span was 2011. All the other years were represented by at least 1 alumni. The 2 with the greatest numbers were 2012 and 2016. And I really just attribute that to the snowball effect in that there were individuals within those graduating classes who interviewed with me and then shared it with others who were from same graduating class. Also, some of them were siblings too. That was the other thing that I saw on a couple occasions. So when we look at characteristics by pronouns, there were 7 that identified as he, him, his, 11 that were she, her, hers, 1 that were they, their, theirs, and 1 that was he, they, them. So the vast majority of my participants were either she, her, hers, or he, him, his. And then when we look at characteristics by ethnicity, the majority of my participants were either Black/African or Caucasian. However, I had individuals from other ethnic groups as well too. I'm not surprised by this, and I'm thrilled to see this simply because SLA is a very diverse school in of itself. And so I'm glad that I was able to capture a little bit of that diversity, at least via ethnicity, in the data. And then when we look at the actual interview participants, so there were 12 interview participants. What you're seeing here is their chosen pseudonyms, which are referred to in the dissertation, the graduation year. All of them except for 1 of them attended SLA for 4 years, 1 attended for 3 years, and then you can see their current profession. So it's really fascinating because you would think at a STEM school, many of them would go into STEM, science, technology, engineering, math-related fields. But you have individuals that are in environmental stewardship, that are farmers, that are video editors, that are in K-12 education, that are in IT and engineering, in music, in museum education. It's a very fascinating look at how they've all kind of gone off and done change in different ways within their own chosen fields. So what are the actual results? So first we'll look at the quantitative data as gathered through Miller's social issues questionnaire. So the first element looked at social justice self-efficacy. And so you can see across the board, all but one of these issues where they were considering their own social justice self-efficacy, they either had strong confidence or some confidence. The one with poor confidence was addressing structural inequalities and barriers facing racial and ethnic minorities by becoming politically active. And so I'll just talk about this now, especially as we dive into the quantitative data. I think this is why I'm very happy that this is a mixed method study, okay? Because if all I had were the survey data from the social issues questionnaire, I would not have as rich of an understanding as I do as a result of having the mixed methods. And so specifically with this one, this is a good example of this. So when we look at the survey and we look at the quantitative data, it seems that alumni who have graduated from SLA really are not comfortable addressing structural inequities, et cetera, barriers, and becoming politically active. But when I interviewed them, as it's the case with many of these things where you kind of see a difference, they would actually talk about things that they're doing. And again, a lot of times it came down to the fact that when they thought about political action or they thought about being a change agent, they were thinking about big picture things and not the small things that are just as much as being a change agent that were happening in their communities. When we look at social justice interest questions, again, we see either some or strong interest in all of these. Another good one that I'll give here, you can see with the first one about volunteering. It's interesting because the mean was 3.7. It's a 1 to 5 scale, by the way. And so the quality was some interest, but yet every single person that I interviewed talked about volunteering in their community. And again, it was the idea that, well, I'm not really doing anything big. I'm helping out with some type of volunteer function with my church, or I'm helping out, once a month at a soup kitchen or something like that. And again, I think a lot of it was just simply they were thinking big picture, and we're not thinking about the small intentional acts that they do in their everyday lives. And so kind of in retrospect, I think that if maybe I had given a little bit more explanation there, if that data might have been different. And then the last area, social justice commitment questions. This is another one where it's very interesting when you look at the quantitative data versus the qualitative data, because you really see here the vast majority of these 4 areas they're neutral on, okay? But yet when I asked them about, with the last question of my interview, actually talked to them about their social justice identity going forward into the future, every single one that I talked about issues that they were passionate about and things that they wanted to do, especially as they gain more skills, whether it's finishing college education or something they're doing with their career right now, etc. So this doesn't necessarily agree with what I got out of the qualitative data of this study. So then let's look at the journal and interview qualitative data. So a lot of how I looked at the school first was to look at through the school through the lens of social justice literacy, specifically in the interview questions. And so we deliberately talked about each social justice literacy in each interview. So the first one is functional literacy. So the definition of that North gives of functional literacy is the ability to live appropriately as an autonomous and informed citizen. Over and over again in interviews, I heard from students how they were currently talking about current events in classrooms, having discussions formally and informally with their teachers, and then actually doing some type of action around that, whether it was like part of the curriculum or whether it was something that they were doing after school. For example, they talked about going to the school district of Philadelphia over an issue that they were interested in. One individual, Jay, talks about how he actually, because of a discussion that occurred in his classroom, he ended up going to the Philadelphia government building and ended up working with a councilwoman as an intern as a result, and really learned a lot as a result of that. And he said if he had never had the discussion and never really taken the action, that never would have occurred. We look at critical literacy, which is the ability to challenge existing paradigms of knowledge, question institutionalized power relations, and build strategies for equity and social justice. And I saw this over and over again. Students often talked about their ELA classes and their social studies classes, about how it was so much deeper, this connects back to what I was talking about earlier, than just a fact-based idea, okay? That here's the dates, or here's the knowledge that we need, which as social studies educators, we are moving far away from now. It's not the way that we teach good, or we should teach good social studies education. And so the idea that they really dived into what they were studying. So Albert gave an example of how the Civil War, and specifically slavery in the United States, is talked about, and specifically how they looked at the language, not only within different textbooks, within different conversations, et cetera, and how that's very different, and they connected that to the lost cause narrative, et cetera. Basically, they dived very deep into the actual learning. It was much bigger than just understanding the terrible things that occurred with slavery, but the language behind that and the overarching, I don't know what word I want to use, the remnants that are still left as a result of an institution that was ended now over 150 years ago. When we look at relational literacy, out of all the literacies, this is the one that I heard about the most strongly and commonly among alumni. And it is when we create mutual connections between humans who are without bias or prejudice and who also care for one another. Over and over and over again, students talked about how they not only felt cared for and understood by their other classmates, but also by their teachers. They talked about how literally, Emmett talks about how literally SLA brings individuals from every zip code in Philadelphia who she would have never had the opportunity to get to know or to hear their perspective had that not been the case. I heard that over and over and over again in interviews. And Jay talks about, and actually several students brought this up, SLA had the longest lunchtime, and maybe still does, of any public school in Philadelphia. And at first I thought, oh, that's okay, that's kind of weird. But then I thought, you know, I wonder if there's an intentionality behind that. And that the idea that these individuals that are very different from all over Philadelphia have time to meet each other at the table and be human beings and learn from one another and get to interact with one another. And I think that that's probably intentional into the design of SLA. So we look at democratic literacy, which is the ability to promote the common good and resolve conflicts without utilization of physical violence. And so again, I gave the example of going to the school district headquarters. The other piece here I heard with students about how they often engage with publications or different media outlets as a part of what they were doing, whether it was the radio, whether it was the news media, et cetera. And Paul actually talks about in his history class how he used Harkness discussions, which is a whole methodology of discussion. And as a result, similar to maybe if you've heard of like Socratic seminars or things like that, as a result of that type of discussion, his eyes were really open to other people's thoughts and really just to think much more deeply than he ever did, especially about issues that we could consider controversial. And then visionary literacy, the last piece, which encourages students to envision a future in which they promote justice, equity, and democracy, and thus create change in their communities. So I think Max epitomizes what I was hoping to see in the research here when he talks about being at SLA, you were always surrounded by people who were passionate, so passionate that it became contagious. And that is something that I heard in different formats through the different interviews that I had, that when you are surrounded by people who are passionate, who care about one another, who are interested in about societal issues, et cetera, you too become passionate and interested in those things and want to make change. So the creation of change agents. Don't dial me now. There we go. Okay. So there's a lot of examples that you can read in my dissertation. I'll just give you a few here. So Amet is now living with her partner on a small farm. She calls herself Two Little Girls on a small farm in rural Washington State who are committed to environmental stewardship and specifically growing produce and teaching people how to use it and selling it at affordable prices. Amelia talks about how SLA was the catalyst for her becoming the person that she is today. She says that I was introduced to the idea that inequalities that I always knew exist in the country were not just due to individual bad actors, but could be due to systematic issues. Most importantly, I learned that we could design a better system. Janie talks about that as a Black female, she had three strikes from birth: being Black, being female, and not being upper class. And that idea of those strikes completely were turned on its head when she went to SLA and became empowered. She said SLA teachers instilled a fire in every student that if they work hard and have passion, they can be change agents as well as advocate for the faintest of voices. She's now a teacher and is doing that with her own students in her own classroom. So wrapping things up with my key findings and discussion, when I did a word cloud of all my interviews, this is the word cloud that I saw. And I really pulled three big things out of what SLA is doing and what I heard. First, the power of relationships. Second, the power of diversity. And then the power of SLA's core values. So when we talk about teachers, I want to share something that Bell Hooks says. When teachers teach with love, combining with care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust, we're often able to enter the classroom and go straight to the heart of the matter, which is knowing what to do on any given day to create the best climate for learning. And this is epitomized in all the data that I gathered, especially in those interviews, that students felt cared for, that students were experiencing this. When we talk about their core values, which I introduced earlier, over and over again, students were connecting how their adult lives connected to those specific core values and how they still, in many cases, think about those core values, because it wasn't just something that was on a piece of paper that everybody kind of knew was there, but it was something that was actually lived. And then the power of diversity. I've kind of talked a little bit about this piece in that, students were pulled from all over Philadelphia, and many students, when I asked them, how would your life be different had you not attended SLA? One of the things that I so frequently heard was, I would not have met the people that I had met, and I would not have had the diverse understanding and ideas that I had, because I would have been at a predominantly white school, I would have been at a predominantly Black school, or I would have been at this private institution, etc. And so over and over again, I heard about the power of diversity from those students. So takeaways. So for school leaders, there's a couple things that I could suggest. If possible, visit SLA in Philadelphia with your actual learning community. Establish and live those school values. Don't make it just something that's on a piece of paper. Incorporate inquiry-based learning. And then I've given a couple book recommendations that you can check out. For facilitators of learning, for my teachers, my people, you can create change in your own classroom. I think that's really important, because many people feel like they are this little island of social justice, and I get that. And so don't underestimate the power that you have as a teacher, even if you're not in a school that's committed to social justice. You have a lot of power. Relationships, which I think is beaten into our head, especially when we're pre-service teachers. But I cannot emphasize the importance of building relationships, not only with our students, but their entire community, their parents, their guardians, the community of the school, etc. Students talked about that over and over again in the research. Incorporate inquiry-based learning into your own curriculum. Think about how you might be able to develop some of those skills with your students through the curriculum that you're teaching. And then teach media sourcing, bias, and current events. Have those discussions with students. Give the students the tools so that they can become more informed and more active citizens. And I also have a few book recommendations for you as well. So finally, to end my presentation, which is now over the time limit, I'm sorry. I'll end with two quick quotes. I always have to go to LBJ, who's my favorite president. I talk about this in my dissertation. He says, "At the desk where I sit, I've learned one great truth. The answer to all of our national problems, the answer for all the problems in our world come to a single word, and that word is education." And then from Desmond Tutu, who just recently passed away, "If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor." And I think that both of those things really came out as I looked at not only SLA and what SLA is doing, but the students as change agents now in their communities. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, so we're going to take committee questions now. And Robby, what I'd like you to do is to repeat back the question that you're hearing asked so they get to hear it.
Got it. Okay.
So Dr. Leonard, Dr. Eirich.
I'll go. Okay. Robby, thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
I really enjoyed reading your dissertation several times. And forgive me your work, but I think it would be beneficial for those who are watching.
Sure.
You mentioned that SLA admission is open to anybody within a certain zip code in Philadelphia. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more based on your research and your understanding as an educator for so many years. Do you believe that there's a predisposition for students who might be interested in coming to SLA and how that might impact sort of how they move through the world before coming to SLA?
Can you maybe clarify that just a little bit?
We spent some time talking about bias and sort of lived experiences,
right?
And how that impacts us throughout our lives.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you believe that there is a predisposition or bias or universally lived experience that might lead students to seek attending SLA versus not attending SLA?
So the question is, do I believe that there is, I'm not going to remember every single word, so I'm really sorry. Do I believe that there's some type of bias or something of that nature that leads students to becoming or attempting to enroll, applying for SLA? It's interesting because it did come up, and I don't actually remember if I talked about this in my dissertation at all, but specifically with one of my participants, she talked about how there's been a little bit of a change because she was a student that graduated from SLA earlier, prior to 2015, okay, so within the first 5 years of the school's graduation. And she talked about really at that point, SLA wasn't super well known, okay, and so really the students that were coming were not necessarily, that had always been the plan or something of that nature. And then as SLA recently moved into a new school building, the partnership with the Franklin Institute is no longer now. There's been some changes, et cetera, not really fundamental changes. But now, according to her, and of course, I don't have the experience of the data to really, 100% say one way or another. She talks about how that now it is much more competitive, and the demographics have changed as a result because parents know what's occurring at SLA, not only the education, but some of the social justice focus, although that's not like really an advertisement, for the school itself. And so I would say 5 years ago, probably not. Today, based on what I was told by the participant, probably more so.
So you opened your presentation with Robby by saying that basically teaching for social justice is good teaching, which none of us would argue with that, and that we want students to develop like this critical consciousness and be freedom-fighting intellectuals. At SLA, they do not teach social justice in isolation, but instead within the context of their courses.
Right.
There are other schools that are now trying to teach social justice courses, whether it be in a skinny period or a co-curricular period. If you were hired as a consultant, what advice, what evidence, what research, what would you share with those asking that question? Should this be something that's taught in isolation or should it be embedded within the curriculum?
Sure. So the question is, should social justice be taught as a course in isolation within a K-12 setting, or should it really be incorporated across the board? So it's actually interesting because I have a little bit of experience with this because my first teaching position was at a charter school, Gaston College Prep. And so at the high school, their freshman social studies class was a class called social justice, okay? And I honestly, this is a little bit embarrassing to say, but like that might have been the first time that I ever even heard of social justice, having well, you can read chapter 1 of my dissertation and find out my whole life story. But anyways, so I remember thinking when I first went there that was really a fascinating idea because students were introduced to social justice, and through the class they looked at different social justice movements throughout history. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, but I think especially when I first saw SLA now 3 years ago, something along that lines, and I saw what that looks like when it's not siloed and it's across curriculum. And even like my participants talked about how like one of them even said, like, I don't even know if the word social justice was ever actually mentioned, okay, which I think is powerful in of itself. And so I think it becomes much more powerful when we are using the students' interest, especially about the issues in society that they're concerned about, or raising awareness about issues that they may be concerned about in their communities, and giving them that ability to, I thought something was going on in the corner. That ability to explore them through the lens of ELA, okay, through the lens of social studies, through the lens of their engineering class, is much more powerful than just having it in one silo. But if you've got it in a silo, that's better than nothing. So.
I didn't want to ask all of my questions.
That's all right. Have at it.
So you mentioned one of the forms of communication that you used actually to procure participants was an SLA alumni email update. Did any of your participants mention this form of communication as a method of continued engagement to keep them as engaged as change agents? And if so, do you believe that this sort of supports the ongoing nurturing of these students who are then alumni? And I just want to add, you brought up a quote by the principal of SLA, and that is that students are not annuals, they're perennials, which I wrote down and found very profound. So sort of piggybacking off of that, right? And that it's not just about your time at SLA.
Yeah, you asked a really long question, so it's really hard for me to remember to restate it here. I know how to answer this,
I
but
wish I knew how to concisely ask the questions, and I would. The alumni email.
Right. No. Yeah. So you're asking me if you think that they continue to stay connected and involved in the life and work of the school through the alumni email. Okay. So I can say one thing in fact, that I know that none of my participants came to me as a result of the email. Okay. All of them either came to me as a result of the Facebook post in the individual group, or the snowballing of like, they knew this alumni that had interviewed with me. Okay. And then the second piece, I would hypothesize that because that's the case, that probably the email is not the strongest form of connection that the school has with former alumni. What I'll say that I know in fact is that I had two different alumni who three different alumni who specifically shared how they still speak to their teacher, or even Mr. Lehman himself, how they frequently email back and forth, or how even like they grab coffee or things like that, and sometimes just a simple thing of a teacher checking in, like, hey, how's college going, or how's this going, and things like that. So I think that I would hypothesize that there is probably a lot more informal checking in and communication and connections that are occurring, which are incredibly powerful and continuing that mission of SLA long after those students graduate. Yeah.
And one more question, and I'll try to keep this concise.
Okay, it's okay.
Put it down so I keep concise. So there appears to be a huge component of sort of emotional IQ and having empathy as part of this model. And a lot of that is hinged upon the educators at SLA. So a question for you would be, do you believe, or was it shared with you, that there was a difference in the SLA teachers' professional development?
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to that because I don't have enough of that type of in-depth understanding of SLA, and it's not something that Chris Lehman talks about in his book either. And it's not something that I saw when I was there. I can say that just last week, it's interesting you should ask this. Sorry, for the people online, just asked about if there's a difference in professional development for teachers at SLA. SLA in its new location is actually in the same building as a traditional public school. And one of my in one of the interviews, the alumni actually talked about how at the beginning that was like a really big deal. Because of the school that they're in with now had a reputation. And that's actually where I was talking about earlier. She was talking about how there's been a change in the community, because 5 years ago that would not have been a problem, but now it became a problem when they were initially moving in terms of some parents having concerns about that. Anyways, connecting back to what you just said, I actually just saw last week on SLA's Facebook group that they're actually now doing collaborative professional learning with the teachers from that school and doing, I believe, if I remember right, last week when I saw that post, they were doing some type of planning around inquiry-based learning. But in specifics in terms of what professional learning looks like, what they're doing as a part of professional learning, I don't know.
I'll just ask one final two-part question.
Okay.
And that was, the alumni really kind of minimize the power of their experiences as change agents. So the first part of the question is, which story, which shared experience inspired you the most, and then how are you going to continue to be a change agent?
So the question is, what story from an alumni inspired me the most, and then how am I going to continue to be a change agent? So, I heard some incredible things, although the alumni themselves did not think they were doing incredible. Like the alumni that was talking about her and her partner having the farmer. Like, I just thought that was so very cool that they've taken this passion and they're doing this very cool thing with food and food justice in their communities. And that's a perfect example of something that they were just like, oh, it's not really a big deal. It's like, no, that's a really very cool big deal. And so I saw lots of examples and stories like that. But I think that the one thing that really sticks out to me, and it's really at the heart of who I am as a teacher as well too, in my own philosophy when I think about teaching. One of the students shared, and I share this in the dissertation itself, how relatively recently, in the last year or so, she had emailed Chris Lehman, the principal, and had said, I feel like in some ways I'm a disappointment because I'm not doing anything big in the community. I've gone to college, I've done, the things that I'm supposed to do, etc. But I feel like I haven't done anything like really big yet, and you guys were preparing us to do big things. And paraphrasing, because I don't remember the exact quote off the top of my head, he responds to her in the email and basically says that was never the goal. That was never the goal of what we were doing at SLA. The goal was to make you a person that A, knew who they were cared for, and B, who was going to go out and care for other people. And that's what's most important. So in that aspect, you've exceeded our pieces. And so I think that really hit home, because that's what, at the end of the day, I've always thought about with my students. And I've always told this to my students that I have taught. And many of them who I've thought about in this past week as I've been preparing for this moment. I love history. You can name something and we can sit here and we can have a good old conversation, and probably everybody but you and Dr. Brown and I will fall asleep. And I can talk about it. I can make anything about history exciting. But at the end of the day, whether in 10 years from now, my students can tell me what the importance was of the Battle of Vicksburg and the Civil War, really doesn't matter to me, okay? It doesn't matter to me that they know specific dates for things like that. What is important for me, and what I would be happy the day that I die knowing, is that the students that I had the privilege of learning along with knew that they were loved for and cared for in a classroom. Because so many of them bring so much to their learning. It's a wonder that they are able to overcome that to learn. And when you can build that relationship with the student, with the parent, the guardian, their community, you unlock this ability for a student to ignite their passions and to really make change. And so I think that's why you continue to see relationships come up in this. I just kind of highlighted here, but it comes up over and over and over again in the interviews with students. And I think that for me, that's something going forward when I think about being a change agent, I'm especially cognizant of. So I'm no longer in a high school classroom, but now I have adults who are coming to me because they want to learn how to become a paramedic and save people's lives. It's different than teaching history, but at the heart of it, a classroom's a classroom. Okay, people are human beings, and people have the same innate needs and desires, and things like that. And so, even with my adult students, I strive to create that same type of community so that they are empowered to create change. And now, not only are they empowered to create change, they're empowered to save lives now, which is it's kind of cool in of itself. And so I think like that for me is how I continue to strive to be a change agent moving forward. I could never just, like if I had left teaching last year and just been like, I'm done teaching, I could not survive, because it's what I thrive on. Like it is my passion, it is my heart. Yeah, so I have to be teaching in some way. So, yeah. I'm sure you do.
So this is a really different dissertation than you originally set out to do. You were going to compare 3 different schools.
God help me.
And so when you reflect on that now, I don't know quite how to phrase this question, but what do you think the affordances were of looking just closely at SLA? What do you think? Do you have any regrets of not taking up 3 different schools?
Sure. So the question is that initially I was thinking about looking at 3 different types of or different schools, okay, with social justice focuses instead of just one. And so what I think the affordances of that were, and if I had any regrets, correct? Okay. So, well, this wouldn't have been a 4-year process, I'll say that. What do you think? You get 6 years? I would have been right up to the end of the line if I had done the other. You know, I think that in one way, it's good because it really allowed me to focus just on one school. And I think you can get a little bit more rich data when I'm digging or taking a ladle deeper into that pot, okay? Whereas if I had been doing 3 different schools, each which I had chosen with 3 very different designs, okay, that would have been a lot of data. And it's not just a piece of like coding that data and analyzing that data, et cetera. It's just that I think that when I think about the 3 schools I was considering, there are pretty big fundamental differences. I think they're all doing great things. But I think that as a result, the results would have been muddied a little bit. And so I still think, and it's what I talk about in my dissertation in terms of opportunities for future research, it would be interesting to now then look at some of the other schools, like charters or private schools that are social justice focused, or public schools that are not even a magnet status. I think it would be really interesting to see if some of the same ideas are presented when you're discussing those things. And so I don't really think that I have like specific regrets. I'm glad that you kind of helped to steer my thinking to one school. And I honestly have loved getting to know more about SLA, but specifically interacting with those alumni over the last year.
Other questions from the committee? Okay, so we'll open up to audience questions. So Dr. Brown, if you have any questions, I'll also scoot over to the laptop. If anyone, Robby, actually, if you could invite people who are online if they have any questions.
Yeah, so if anybody online has any questions, you can type into the chat, and Dr. Hurst is monitoring the chat if you have any questions for me. Dr. Brown?
Are there any specific academic requirements?
So I don't have enough information to answer your question on that. I don't know enough about the application process to know. The question was if there were academic requirements to get into SLA. So I'm not sure. I don't know.
Next question is, you said that each student has an education plan, but not the same as students with special needs.
Yeah.
Are students with special needs accepted into the school?
Yes, and so actually one of my participants talked about that in an interview, that she came to the school, and she came to school, what she described as very far behind were her words. And she did come with an IEP. And so as soon as she said that, I latched onto that in an interview. I was like, oh, I want to know more about this process. And one of the things that she talked about was that she felt like for the first time, and I think part of this is probably from her discussions with her parents as well too now as an adult, that her IEP meetings were more than just let's check off the box and discuss, what's going on here, and that she felt that those goals that were set in the IEP, separate from the individualized learning plan, that those things were real, and that teachers really truly were working hard with her to meet those deficiencies that she had, or some of the learning challenges that she had. So specifically, she talked about some of the issues that she had with like test anxiety, et cetera. So she had accommodations like extended time and separate setting, et cetera. And so she said that not only because of the way that she was looked at as an individual, but also the fact that it was inquiry-based and assessment was completely different than how it was ever done in the public schools that she had been in prior to that. She really thrived as a learner. And so she looks for the same type of thing in her adult life as well, too, in terms of project-based type of, work.
Last question.
Sure.
You know that in the state of Maryland, service learning is banned.
Right.
With what you've learned through this process, because I think the intent, the unspoken intent of service learning is to help students to become change agents.
Mm-hmm.
With what you've learned through your dissertation study, do you see any avenues to share this information with public school teachers in the effort to, for lack of a better term, to improve what's expected in student learning in the state?
Sure. So the question was considering, service learning as a requirement in the state of Maryland within K-12 education, but specifically also thinking about the creation of change agents and how teachers in the K-12 setting in the state of Maryland might facilitate that process. Is that okay? So I think that the service learning piece is very interesting, and having some experience with that teaching in the state. I think that it can be very powerful, but it's not always done powerful. And unfortunately, it really comes down to the teacher, and it's one of those things that, teachers have 5 million things on their plate, and it's not one of the things that they necessarily always consider. So when I was in the K-12 setting, some of the most powerful service learning opportunities that I saw with teachers and students were when the teacher found someone or something in the community to kind of latch on, build a partnership with, and involve students around, okay? And especially something that could be active, okay? Whether it's the students creating something or whether it's the students actually going out and doing something, et cetera. I think of like Tammy Twigg at Allegheny High School and some of the things that she's done specifically with veterans and things like that. I think that's that's when service learning becomes powerful, is when it's more than a checkbox, okay? When there's some actionable type of item or something that students are doing. And it's especially powerful when we can connect them to members of their community. Because so often students just, especially, our high school students, they don't realize what resources are there in their community. They don't realize what things are being done, even in a small community like here in rural Maryland. And so I think about things like historical research methods, that I taught. And I think the powerful piece of that was not even just the project piece, but the idea that they were connecting with people in their communities, they were building relationships with people in their communities, and they were learning from those individuals. Because when you start to do and have those types of connections at that age, I think it becomes almost ingrained into you, and it's much easier for you to do as an adult. And that's the only way you're going to create change. You can't do it by yourself. So yeah, that's what I would say. And then on the second piece, in terms of, enlightening, or no, I don't like that word. Scratch that. Sharing this with like public school teachers, et cetera. I hope she doesn't cry. I don't know if I ever want to do research on a scale like this again. Okay. Not because it wasn't great. Like, honestly, I have learned more in the last 4 years than I ever would have thought. Okay. But it is mind succumbing. It just takes a lot of mental energy, okay? But I am very interested in writing and doing professional learning for teachers. And I think about specifically some of the books that I read that were just like short 100, 150 page books that were just full of great little, here's a snippet of something and here's some type of strategy or something you could do. And those were always super powerful for me. And so I'd really be interested in that type of thing moving forward, especially as I consider what I learned in the study. Yeah, thank you.
don't see any other questions online.
Okay.
Ask one more time. Say
Yep.
last.
Anybody have any other questions who is online? You can put them in the chat or forever hold your peace.
All right. So I'm not seeing any. So at this point, we're going to pause the live feed. If you want to say that on the microphone too.
Okay.
And then we'll come back after the committee has deliberated.
Okay, so we're going to pause the live feed right now. I'm going to leave the room. The committee's going to deliberate, and then we'll come back. So those of you that are online can just stay online for a few minutes here, and we'll be back in a couple minutes.
mostly based out of Hagerstown.
Oh, okay.
So he's kind of like across the hall.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, well, it is my pleasure to introduce the audience, Dr. Robert May.
Wow.
Your committee was really pleased with your dissertation and your defense today. We thought you've done excellent work that's going to have meaning in the world. And I mean, I'll speak for myself. I would certainly hope that you publish it and share it. And congratulations.
Thank you. I so appreciate everything you three have poured into me, especially you over the last 4 years. Yeah. I got you a sympathy card. It says a thank you card because I'm sympathetic to you.
I get it now.
Yeah.
You didn't know when I started.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. So we're just going to chat with you for a couple minutes
Okay.
about some next steps, and we're going to turn off the live feed. So thank you so much for those of you that have attended. Thanks, Dr. Brown.
Thanks, Steve.
Take care, everybody. That would be great.